I've learned more than 7 languages over the past 25 years, mostly by getting things wrong at first, which is funny really because I didn't even start out as a language person. My degree at university was in jazz piano, but somehow that's where languages crept in. So in this video, I'm going to share 7 completely different stories that shaped how I learned each language, like how I ended up in a Brazilian pop star's mansion and the one terrifying night when I thought I was going to die. And you can steal the best bits of these stories and make it fit your own life. But none of this would have even happened if my girlfriend hadn't dumped me. French was the first language I ever learned properly, and honestly, if this one hadn't worked out, I don't think I would have learned any of the others. So I was 19 years old, living in London, studying music at university, and I'd just gone through a brutal breakup with my girlfriend of 2 years. I took it badly, to say the least. So bad that I bailed out of university and got a job in a cafe. And suddenly I found myself surrounded by people from all over the world. French, Spanish, Swedish, Japanese, all chatting away in 3-4 languages like it was nothing. And then there was me with English only. Seriously, and this heartbreak that I was going through, it made me feel really very small. So instead of dealing with that like a normal person would, I decided to run away to Paris. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to France, but English isn't exactly their favorite language, and my French was hopeful, shall we say. I'd done a couple of months of study with a grammar book. I'd made some paper flashcards and convinced myself that I was basically ready. Yeah, I wasn't, but I was also 19, and 19, you can kind of do anything you want. So by pure luck, I bagged a job working at the front desk of a youth hostel in Paris, and of course the interview for this job was entirely in French. I understood maybe 20% of it. I remember nodding along a lot, and somehow, for some reason, they gave me the job, which looking back was either very generous or completely irresponsible. But suddenly, either way, I was surrounded by French all day, just guessing my way through conversations, just copying people. It was crazy. One day I met a dancer called Luca, and he asked if I wanted to learn French because he was learning English, and we ended up meeting like 2 or 3 times a week, just chatting, doing something called a language exchange. I didn't know that's what it was called at the time, but it really worked. We would do an hour of French and an hour of English, and it was the best thing that could have happened to me. Literally the first time ever that I could just sit down somewhere and talk to someone in my dodgy French and have them correct my mistakes. What this did was give me the space to let everything I'd been learning just filter through and take root in my brain. And I remember getting so confident over the next few weeks that I even found a French girlfriend, which also didn't hurt. But before long, I was talking to the guests in the youth hostel in French without any trouble whatsoever. And all of this taught me something important. Going abroad is not what makes someone fluent. Speaking and practicing speaking a lot is what makes you fluent. You've got to just open your mouth and start. And the beauty about learning a language is you can so easily do this without ever leaving your house. You can find a language partner online or even an AI tool and practice speaking regularly. But the best thing this whole experience taught me was that I, Ollie, could actually learn another language. After learning my first language, French, I decided it was time to learn a second one. I was confident at this point, but I had no way of knowing the danger that I would get into or that it would change the course of my life. So I was early 20s now, back in London, back at music college. They took me back, luckily, and I ended up with this book of poetry by Neruda, the Spanish poet. And instead of practicing piano, I would sort of sit there with that book and a dictionary trying to figure out Neruda's poems, and it was awesome. I was so swept up by the romance of it all that it sealed the deal for me. I would learn Spanish. I couldn't go to Spain, so I got into the textbooks. I tried the traditional approach, a lot like the dull way that we all learned in school. But I was so desperate to practice speaking, so where to find a language exchange partner like I did in France? Well, there were no apps yet. It was 2001, so I would wander around central London listening for Spanish, and when I heard Spanish being spoken, I'd just walk up to strangers and ask if they wanted to start doing a language exchange together. I'm not kidding, literally hunting Spanish speakers. Anyway, one day I finally got to go on a trip to Madrid. I had a friend there, and we were out one night having a great time. Great atmosphere, live music, everyone chatting away and laughing, and I understood almost nothing. My friend had to keep translating everything for me, and I just sat there feeling this crippling embarrassment and shame. It was way worse than my French. That feeling followed me home, and I just remember obsessing over grammar, overthinking everything, trying to build perfect Spanish sentences in my head. I couldn't even roll an R. I felt so stupid, and the more I tried to control Spanish, the worse it felt. About a year after that, I decided to go to Argentina. Maybe doing a trip to South America would light a fire under my Spanish. And I found myself up in the mountains in the north of the country on the border with Bolivia. And in the middle of the night, in my hotel room, I got severe altitude sickness. The air up there was so thin, and I'd probably gone up the mountain too fast for my body to adjust. So I wasn't getting enough oxygen, and basically I couldn't breathe. And once this thought hits you, the thought, what if this doesn't stop? Everything starts to spiral. It's pretty terrifying. Now, as you might have noticed, I survived. I lived to tell the tale, but back then, in the middle of the night, I was too scared to sleep, and I had to calm myself down. So I grabbed the nearest thing that might distract my brain, a Spanish novel. And trying to read it was pretty difficult. It felt like survival. But the strangest thing happened. Even though there was lots in the book I didn't understand, I realized that I could guess a lot of words from the context, and I was actually getting the gist of the story, more or less. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, I know it's because I was seeing Spanish for the first time as the whole language, not just an object of study in my textbook. So over the next few weeks, I read constantly, and Spanish started making sense to me. And you know what's crazy? This was the moment that everything changed. It's how I got the whole idea for my story learning method. And then, just like with French, the thing that really locked it in was a person. And I met this guy from the Canary Islands, Thomas, and we became really good friends. This is London, by the way, and for the next 2 years, we just chatted every single day in Spanish. And that's when my Spanish absolutely skyrocketed and started feeling like part of my life. Now, all of this reading and listening and speaking I was doing wasn't exactly easy, but it also wasn't too hard for me because I always knew what level I was at. And that's the bit that most people never get at the start when they want to learn a language. They either begin reading stuff that's way too difficult for them and spend the whole time confused and wondering if they're bad at languages, or they read stuff that's far too easy, like super beginner textbooks, and then get bored and never really get going. It can even happen to beginners. And you might actually understand more of a language than you think you do, especially if you've heard some of it before in your life. And the annoying thing is, it's usually not the effort that's missing, it's just that you've guessed your level. And when you guess, you end up doing work that doesn't quite fit you, and that's how people lose months without realizing why. And that's why I've put together a free language level test. We've got it for tons of languages. It's quick, it's fun to do, and at the end, you will know, right, this is exactly what my level is and what material I should use to get started. It's completely free. Scan the QR code or hit the link in the description below. Take the test. You will know exactly what your level is in the language, and that will tell you exactly what material you should use to start reading and improving right away. So stories changed everything for my Spanish, but for my next language, I discovered something even more powerful, and it somehow landed me in a Brazilian pop star's mansion, jamming with some of the biggest musical legends in Brazil. So back in London, I made a bunch of Brazilian friends and completely fell in love with the Brazilian culture, especially the music, because music's my thing, remember? Bossa Nova, the world of Bossa Nova just got under my skin, and I used to just find songs, look up the lyrics on the internet and try to decode them, but I didn't understand Portuguese and it was very hard. So I started learning the guitar, and I just started copying, I learned chords and started playing songs and learning them and trying to sing them in Portuguese, even though I didn't understand what I was singing, but I really wanted to. So I'd sing these songs over and over, and I learned like, I don't know, 30 or 40 songs, and without realizing it, Portuguese was seeping into my brain, and I was getting non-stop input from the language, just listening to this, olha que coisa mais linda, it's coming at me all the time. And you know what? This is what immersion actually feels like. My Brazilian friends found it utterly hilarious. They thought, look at this weird British guy just strumming bossa nova and mumbling through Portuguese. But it worked like a charm, and listening to them talking about their culture, musicians that they loved, like Gilberto Gil, Milton Nascimento, and we would just sit up and listen to these guys playing all night, and I became intoxicated with the music and the language. And if I met someone from Brazil, I would even talk to them, sometimes using lines I knew from songs which they loved. The idea of Brazil was like a fantasy to me. So after university, I moved to Rio for 6 months. I got into some music circles, and I somehow found myself making friends with Milton Nascimento, one of the biggest musical stars of all time in Brazil. He's basically the Paul McCartney of Brazil. So there I was, like 20-something guy, getting into all kinds of weird situations in Brazil, traveling out to the favelas to go to the samba schools, and actually playing music with some of these musical icons in their mansions looking over the ocean. And I kept thinking, how on earth did this happen? At first, when I went there, I didn't understand a thing in real Portuguese. It was really hard. I realized that when I was learning in London, I'd been kind of linguistically protected. When I got to Rio, I realized nobody's gonna slow down for me. The slang was off the charts. And all this time, I was only trying to speak Portuguese, doing the best I could. I just made it my whole life because I had to. There was no study plan, just people, conversations, music, all in Portuguese all the time, and this is how I learned. Truth is though, you don't need to be surrounded by native speakers. What you do need is to find something in the culture that you can become obsessed with. Music, shows, sport, a dance class, whatever pulls you in and makes that thing part of your everyday life. Because trust me, when the language starts stealing your evenings, you will not be tempted to quit. It'll become like those TV series with cliffhangers that keep you up after midnight. So Portuguese certainly taught me what happens when you follow your obsession. But Italian started almost the opposite way. It was when someone called my bluff. It was Steve Kaufman, a friend of mine, said to me, all right, you've learned a few languages now. I bet you could learn Italian in just a few months, 3 months in fact, by just listening and reading. So I said, all right then, and I made it much worse by announcing the entire thing on YouTube. And to really trap myself properly, I booked a ticket to Italy for 90 days later and promised to have real conversations on camera when I got there. And at that point, I couldn't just wing it anymore. If people were watching, I needed something solid to hold on to. And there was no romance or music spiral pulling me. So I simply made it easy for myself. I picked one rule and I forced myself to stick to it. And that rule was, for the first month, I wasn't allowed to speak Italian at all. No speaking out loud, no practicing sentences, no singing Italian songs with the guitar, just letting the language pour into my brain every chance I got through listening and reading, which sounds okay when you say it like that, but yeah, emotionally, I gotta say, it was kind of uncomfortable. I'm the guy who speaks, right? But this time it was just coffee, headphones, listening to little Italian stories and podcasts I barely understood over and over again. And if there was text that came with the audio, I'd read along with that at the same time. I found this incredibly helpful because your brain can match the sounds with the words on the page. But every instinct in my body was to interfere, was to start to study grammar, find an Italian person to practice with, but I didn't. I stayed with the experience instead, and that was new for me. Now, I wasn't lost exactly. I'd done this before, but this time I was deliberately holding myself back, trusting that understanding would show up if I gave it enough space. So 4 weeks later, when I could finally speak after that month, I booked a video call with an Italian tutor, fully expecting a car crash, and instead, well, Italian just came out of my mouth. It was kind of awkward, but she understood what I was saying. From there, it snowballed pretty fast. I ditched most of the beginner material. I started watching and reading things I actually liked, even when I only half understood them. I allowed myself to look up grammar only when I really had to. I was speaking more, reading more, basically just bumping into Italian all day. And when I finally got to Italy, it didn't feel like some big test. It was just all pretty natural and awesome. And I'd learned something new. If other people are watching because you've told them your plan, quitting stops becoming an option. So a bit of self-inflicted pressure is a pretty helpful medicine. Now, by the time I started learning Japanese, a few languages had already gone pretty well. And that's exactly why Japanese was the one that caught me out. I was confident, probably too confident, and I decided to do something bigger and just assumed that my skills would transfer. I remember thinking, I'm going to move to Japan, immerse myself in Japanese, and it will all come together. So I took an English teaching course, I got myself a job at a school in Japan, and this time I was the language teacher, which in my head meant that I'd be speaking fluent Japanese in 6 months. But that is, of course, not what happened at all. Work is where you spend most of your time, right? And my job was teaching English. The only friends I made were English speaking too, because it's Japan, right? Not Brazil. It's much harder to drift into social circles in Japan. So instead of chatting with locals, I found myself alone in my room, working through textbooks night after night. It's incredibly frustrating. And this was a new experience for me. I wasn't slacking. I wasn't half-hearted. I was genuinely trying to learn Japanese the way that I had learned other languages and getting absolutely nowhere. So 2 years passed like this and Japanese just didn't play along. I won't lie, I felt like a bit of a fraud because people had started to call me the language guy. Yeah, didn't feel like it. Now eventually, out of stubbornness more than wisdom, I started meeting people for language exchanges, that old trick, remember that? And so I'd meet people in cafes in Tokyo, and for an hour every day we would only speak Japanese. Hour in Japanese, hour in English. In the Japanese time, no English escape hatch allowed. I did this for months and kept it fairly light, no pressure, just making the arrangements. And after a while, real proper Japanese started coming out of my mouth without me having to force it. I even noticed that I was catching bits of other conversations going on in the cafe. For the first time, it felt like it might actually work. For my next language, I barely had time to breathe. Cantonese. It's the hardest language I've ever taken on, and that's not me being dramatic. It's a lot of stuff. It's the tonal system. I mean, it's just relentless. You can say the same syllable in Cantonese, 9 different ways and accidentally order soup instead of sugar with your coffee. So from the very beginning, I knew this was going to be a long project. And the tricky part was timing, because at this point, when I started learning Cantonese, I was working full-time in Qatar, of all places, and also doing a master's degree. I don't do things by halves, you see, and I genuinely didn't really have any proper studying time available to me. But I was doing all the stuff, I was doing all the podcasts and all the focus study that I could, and a couple of months into it, guess what? I burnt out. I genuinely couldn't cope, but I was hell-bent on learning the language, so I changed tack. I decided to watch a full TV series in Cantonese. It was called Triumph in the Skies, and it had 96 episodes. I don't mean just listening in the background while I was doing the washing up, actually watching it. So I would sit up in the evening and spend my evenings watching this TV series, sometimes at my lunch break at work. Whenever I could steal in an episode or two, I did. I was practically drowning my brain in Cantonese at every opportunity while everyone else was binging Game of Thrones Season 2. The right year? I don't know. I still did some focused actual study work in Cantonese. I had a tutor, learned some vocabulary, but what surprised me was what changed first. It wasn't my grammar, that's for sure. What happened was my tutor started saying to me, Olly, your tones in Cantonese are starting to sound a lot more natural, which was very weird because I hadn't been doing any pronunciation work at all. What had happened was I'd just been absorbing it from binging this TV show. Now, I won't lie, Cantonese did not click quickly for me, and I'm still working on it today, but somewhere along the way, I stopped needing it to feel easy, and I was just having fun with it. The thing is, I was still tired, I was still busy, I was still getting a lot of things wrong. So for me, on a personal level, just enjoying the language started to matter more than I expected. Then all of a sudden, Arabic was staring at me. See, I knew I was going to be in Egypt for a while, so this wasn't one that I could just do by halves. I'd moved to Cairo because I got a promotion, and I decided, right, I'm stuck here now, I'm going to take this language seriously. Pretty quickly, I ran into a problem. Almost all the study material that I could find was in what's called Modern Standard Arabic, which is the formal version of the language that you might hear on the news, for example. But it's not what people actually speak day to day. What I wanted to learn was Egyptian Arabic, the language people use to buy bread, argue with taxi drivers, chat with their friends, just life. So I went looking for Egyptian Arabic teachers online and roped in a few junior staff at work, and we would sit down for an hour here and there and just talk. No syllabus, no grand plan. I kept asking the same questions. How do I say this? What would you actually say there? And I would memorize whole phrases. I start using them in different situations, tweaking them as I go. And you know what? It started to work. Before long, I could get around Cairo and do everything I wanted to do without too much trouble. Then one night in a taxi, the driver started asking me about religion, what I believed, who made the world, all of that. I told him I wasn't religious, and he just couldn't process it. Where did all of this come from if there's no God? He kept pushing, genuinely baffled. And then before I realized anything, it hit me. I was having this very surreal conversation in Arabic about something that actually mattered to the guy. I didn't learn any of this stuff from a textbook, just a real conversation with an Egyptian guy in the middle of Cairo in a taxi at night. I got home thinking, that really shouldn't have worked, but it did. Okay, so now there's one part of the story I left out, and I wasn't quite ready to admit it, but I actually tried learning 2 of these languages at the same time, more than once. It went badly in ways I really didn't expect. And that's the story for this next video, because you really do have to hear what happened.